some extent.
True, actually. And the use of RTI to get information, I think, for speed up. So maybe these two, that's it.
Public access to information.
Public access to information. Topic of research at my school. Like basically, I'm not associated with any more school right now because I'm in school right now. But then when I was teaching in people were discriminated. And similarly, I think we had an HRC project on what you call actually jail inmates because of living conditions, but I don't know where it is.
Time. How much time do we have? 6 minutes left.
Oh, okay.
We have this
And
is
maybe a little more, maybe 10 minutes.
This is getting some response from students. A student telling they want to see this. So it may reflect in certificate or not. That is, we are still working on that.
Any other ideas and discussions?
I would like to talk to all the stakeholders involved here. So, faculty,
KTM model उनको auto में पढ़ा mainly
2-3 points we can, because we need to give the
अभी सेकंड का भी हमारे सेम ही होगा बिकॉज़
One and two,
पहला
no,
नहीं
no.
किया जब पहला नहीं किया तो दूसरा भी
1 and 2, no. 3 partly.
हाँ
3 partly, we have shared some of us. Fourth also, no.
Fourth actually goal 16 but till 2 months back. That is the last time I
No,
took the Niti Aayog slide. Goal 16 was silent.
Exclusively with the state
On the
district legal
23rd
service
election,
authority, वो
2
कहाँ
months back there was
वो
nothing.
हमारे पास ही नहीं आते हैं.
But there is
We don't
नहीं हम लोग
interaction, no, no.
हमारा तो
corruption.
उनके साथ ही चल रहा है
corruption.
Partly, yes.
हमारे लीगल क्लिनिक उनके लॉ के साथ ही चल रहा है
But we don't discuss directly SDG topics in the news.
नहीं ये तो नहीं बोला
Fourth में.
ना इन्होंने गाइड नहीं है एसडीटी कहाँ का नहीं बोला
4.
मैं तो अलग है सवाल में मेरे पास कि स्पेसिफिकली आपने
Yes,
जैसे जैसे एलएसएस से
one man
की
already
बात
saying
की
it.
वो नहीं पूछा है तो ये भी तो एंगेज
I think that's for all the answers.
this is the
Not expressly, but gets incorporated anyway.
so you can
Questions wise, no? Questions one onwards.
Yeah.
Maybe we want to write some examples which you discussed.
that
like
I
So
think-
examples actually fall within my law school curriculum.
घर में बहुत सारे मिले घर में बहुत सारे
That we will. No, she
We need reporters now, and Jorge, who is the reporter in your group? I'll give you.
ये भी we have imposed on her.
Hello everyone. So on behalf of Group 2, which was about just societies, a large part of the discussion I think for us was about the first question, about whether we as law school faculty incorporate SDGs expressly and specifically into the curriculum. I think the consensus was that they do get incorporated, but just by the way, because they are anyway part of the subjects that are being taught, such as human rights or PIL or other subjects, but including family law and others. But there is no specific systematic reference to SDGs while curriculum planning happens. So that was the summary on the first question. There were other inputs such as SDGs going into research, such as LLM dissertations, where students specifically focus on topics coming from the development goals, and also electives such as the CBCS, the choice-based credit system, involving courses that are around SDGs. About law clinics, which was the second topic, and these were the only two questions that our group could really engage in. The second question was about clinics, and I think the consensus was yes, SDG issues do get incorporated in the law but there is I think, an understanding that is a need for a lot more planning ahead and to expressly take note of SDGs at all levels, starting from the leader of the university, the faculty members, and people who head and run the law clinics. So at all levels, there's a need to wake up to the fact that there are SDGs and we should really look at it.
Thank you very much.
So Ross, your, yeah, process. Oh, you just, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. In relation to question 1, has my law school faculty discussed incorporating SDG into the curriculum? So our answer was, we found out that it is not done as a collective exercise. We failed to mention specifically, systematically, but we do offer elective courses, seminar courses, in which these kind of dialogues, research do take place. 2, has my law school been involved in the development of 2030 vision plan? That long question. No. But we do have our own vision plan, which we feel that we must align with 2030. Normally our vision plans are 2 years or 3 years or midterm plans and so on. So maybe we must re-look into that and bring 2030 in our vision plan. Question 3, which of the SDG topics on the roadmap chart? Many points came out and some of them are, yes, we do handle gender, we do handle poverty, RTI figures the top list, accountability is being discussed a lot, and in most of the constitutional law papers, we do discuss these things. At clinics level, the poverty and the violence prevention is very seriously taken. Again, in the seminars and workshops and certificate programs that we offer, we do give credits based on these things. Question 4, is my law school engaged with the state or district legal services authority in addressing any of the topics listed in the SDG topics? It's a partial answer, yes, or partial no, but our own legal aid cells and legal aid clinics, they do interact with the state legal services and district legal services authority in doing it. And especially the clinical papers which we have in legal education, the 4 clinical papers which we have, it's a mandatory paper. We actually send students to these institutions. Question 5, what ideas and priorities from this discussion shall I take back to prompt discussion at my law school? I think this figured the maximum in my list. So first we felt that we must take it to the faculty board, discuss it. We must include all these ideas in the seminars and the electives and the optional courses which we bring. Then we must bring alumni into our board, which from law schools and most of the law schools, in an informal way we are doing it. It must be done in a formal way. Then we must bring industry interface between academia and industry and practitioners angle in order to bring. And then we must think about how to link each and every course that we teach, these SDG questions. One liner here or there, one idea here or there, some insight needs to be linked to, is what we understood. What ideas, question 6, what ideas from this discussion are worthy of further consideration for regional efforts? So many of them came along with all the things which we are given. Where we failed to bring that idea was the internationalization aspect or the global aspect, in which we feel that internationalization and globalization is always a topic under the international law, which is figuring very minuscule or a minor role in the curriculum list. So these are the things, 6 questions which we found, and our takeaways are very simple, that We do incorporate some angles of SDG, but it's scattered. It's not yet a concerted collective effort. We are not able to do it. We must develop dialogue, and most important, we came up with, we need to identify the challenges in our institutions where these deadlocks we are facing in order to implement the SDGs. The last take was, if at all SDGs inclusion fails, we will promote it as values. Need not be necessarily under the category of SDGs, because it may be a little difficult. The faculty autonomy or pedagogy freedom is what is normally spoken about. So we felt that we must also give attempt by bringing the values which are there couched in the language of the SDG, which normally gets easily identified with all the subjects. So these are the key takeaways. Thank you.
Yes,
Rating Group 1. Well, SDG curriculum is not expressly discussed by the teachers, but we have incorporated whatever is there in our curriculum indirectly or directly. For example, we have women's participation and community development programs, where from the community we pick up the women and we train them, and paralegal training is given to them. Secondly, we have certain programs with National Human Rights Commission, like on human rights and on children's rights and also on basic human rights. So these 3 training programs are conducted. Thirdly, we also have a program with Law Commission, where we train the women in using smartphone for their economic and their trade and small-scale businesses. So it's not directly incorporated in the syllabus, but indirectly it is there. So we have short-term courses, for example, gender law and equality, where we talk about equality and so on and so forth. Second question, we were talking about that, which are the most prime regional concerns. So prime regional concerns topics, what we found out was migration, because it's transboundary. We were talking about culture and peace and violence, human trafficking and forced labor. So these are the prime regional concerns what we really have. We thought about shared learning experiences, accepting it and then knowing about it. So that's the takeaway home. And we also talked about good research, collaborative research. For example, having collaborative research with Indian Council of Social Science Research or other bodies, National Human Rights Commission or State Human Rights Commission, so that we can have a proper collaborative research.
Thanks, Ujjwala. I'm here just to add a couple of points that we didn't really synthesize, but might be worth sharing for other groups to reflect on. I think one was it made sense for us to get into the question of how does one translate possible universal or national level goals and indicators into very, very micro level cultural contexts and the difficulty involved with that task. Second, just as a method, we found it useful as we were looking at all the questions on that list, and our facilitators were chasing us and telling us that we were out of time. We very quickly zeroed in on what would be useful would be to talk about from a regional perspective, where does it make sense through the SDGs 16 framework to collaborate on. And I think Ujjwala gave you a sense of how migration and trafficking and a general culture of peace and violence became important in that perspective. Third, we carried out a quick kind of survey from within that circle with specific sub-indicator or sub-goal, if I may, had the greatest resonance with most people. So within that peaceful society circle, a lot of folks felt that the culture of peace and non-violence really spoke to them as a goal or an objective to be aspired towards. And that was followed next by violence against women and girls and issues relating to children. Those 3 were the most important in many people's minds in constituting a peaceful society. other two discordant notes. One was there is a hidden agenda possibly with the SDG 16 that has not been complicated enough. And the final point of how does one goal really connect to another in our local contexts, and how do we actually think of the relevance of a goal to a person located in a geography? Those were points that came up.
One more point to add on. We were also talking about the difficulty in incorporating SDGs, the vernacular language and the cultural context. These were two very important things which we were really worried about. Thank you.
To the extent that the purpose of the session was to heighten awareness of SDG 16 and SDG 16 plus, I feel like a lot of conversation very quickly did achieve that goal. In terms of the regional issues, the third group in particular identified, those seem very appropriate in India, and the second group mentioned internationalization as a possible topic. Though I suppose that could mean critiquing an international framework like this, as well as ways to get policies.
Thanks to all the groups. As Jane mentioned, our objective was to create awareness of SDGs among justice educators, because NITI Aayog is very seriously going ahead with putting the figures down, right from the state-wise, national level figures, state and local levels. So as educators, we need to see that when this progress report goes in 2030, I think we all should have a role in it. We should all have to see to it that we are aware of what is going as our indicators of progress. Are they the correct indicators? Are they the right indicators? And what kind of indicators are there? That is one aspect that we thought we will highlight with this. And second thing is, a lot of student-led projects are happening throughout the world. Student-led, university-led projects are happening on SDG goals. So we can see if we can do something. Thank you.
One thing I mentioned, you're saying we can look at it in 2030. We actually can look at it in 2020, because and again in 2030. But in 2020, India is presenting its voluntary national review, which is a big report as well as like very brief statement, formal statement of the United Nations itself. But again, it's going to be a fascinating document to study, to have students study some small part of it, to get familiar with how this is done. And it's a platform for people to raise objections to the way that certain reports are being made, critique of indicators chosen, and so forth. So I have attended a couple of things at the UN this year on behalf of another NGO based in New York. And I found it a really stimulating set of conversations and opportunities for interaction with people all over the world who are actually very well versed in this. They've worked on getting 16 countries. We were saying, Gagan was telling me earlier about working to get justice, peace justice, and strong institutions in the SDGs, because in the Millennium Development Goals it was not there. So the fact that it's there, it seems to be law schools should not be on. Any last comments? Having heard people's reports.
Get involved in making India reports. Civil society organizations and as academics, we do get involved in making the reports that go to the youth. Many of us. This report, I think we need to look into it and get more involved.
Are we going to hear any more about the India Justice Report? other countries and by NGOs. I mean, there's a lot of provocative reading there in terms of what should indicators be. So, anyway, thank you very much for your participation. We know it was a sort of a hit and run exercise.
In conversation with some of you have discovered that people have missed their flights and people have waited 3 hours for flights and people have not slept for 2 or 3 days, etc. In making it here. So at the outset of this session, I want to recognize once again that people who think and talk justice education are quite often the hardest workers and most rules of teachers at least. That's to be followed by a very heartfelt thank you for making the time. It's really appreciated and that makes this time spent together very special as well. I think our morning panel opened up a number of interesting binaries for me, that is law versus justice, legal education versus justice education. Should I be thinking of the macro picture and building something new, or should I be thinking of what I currently do and continue to? Okay, sorry. So, as I was saying, the morning set panel, is that better? Maybe I should also speak slightly slower. The morning panel opened up a number of interesting binaries for me, some of which were law and justice, legal education and justice education, a focus on the macro, let's build something new and let's critique the entirety of the whole, versus how do I focus on my craft, where I'm located, and do that well and recognize the value that comes out of that conversation, right? And I think as a colleague told me immediately after that session, now the challenges and how we synthesize all of that. I think what I would like to say is let's treat these as a number of seeds that have been strewn into fertile ground, right? And let's not be too rushed in necessarily closing out discussions or agreeing on the one way forward. In fact, one of the earliest provocations that this event received, and the agent provocator is in the room now, it was, why is it the future of justice education and not the futures of justice education? What is this hegemonic imagination for one future of justice education? So on that note, I think I would like to turn our attention to a fabulously interesting range of speakers. We, unlike the other panels on the program, have 6 speakers for today. So I'm going to request presenters to try and limit themselves to 10 to 12 minutes, and I'm going to urge you in your questions and comments after the presentations to firstly try and be as focused and precise as possible, and also try and respond to multiple points that came up from the presentation. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Usha Ramanathan, who has titled her comments as Experiments with Law and Justice. Experiments with Ideas of Law and Justice. Awesome. Over to you.
I'm not going to pretend that I have some great qualification to speak to any of you here, because I'm not a full-fledged teacher, but it's just that every two very big may count. That's the only reason. I just want to say a few things, because it's a short time, so I'll just say it like shorthand. The first thing is something that happened here and in Krishna University, both these places. In thinking about matters of law and justice, we tend to standardize too fast. And that sometimes leaves out things which ought to be part of the way we think about things and what we build into the curriculum and what we get students to engage with. It's not just about learning, it's also about the implications that it has. Because for instance, to give you a direct example, it's shaping of the Constitution. Most universities teach the Constitution without
teaching the fifth schedule. Those who do refer to the fifth schedule, it's literally like a reference, and that happens because some case law has come on the fifth schedule. Otherwise, it really wouldn't be what we would focus on. And the fifth schedule has become important for a range of reasons. It's become important in itself. It's because of where the tribal communities are today in the various dialogues around tribal communities. It's because all talk of growth and development has something to do with these communities, and it's a large percentage of our population. It's not like it's some negligible percentage. 10 states have fifth schedule areas. There are law schools that are located in these 10 states, and the first time I went to one of these law schools and asked the person who was in charge at that time, who was actually, there was no vice chancellor there at that time, there was no senior professor, there was this person, and I said, you're in the fifth schedule area, do you have anything to do, what are you doing with the tribal areas around? Do you go out there, what's your learning? He said, yes, we go. We are actually conducting a program there, and I said, what program? He said, we're teaching them about the domestic violence law. And I was like, no, I'm not asking what you are teaching them. You're sitting there, have you absorbed anything at all? Because you can't teach if you don't know. So you know the law, you know the constitution. Are you going out there to figure out what this law and the constitution means in this area? And it was very difficult for them to understand because we do have the sense that we have hegemony on knowledge. And we have little to learn and only things to disseminate. I think if we break that down a little bit, it could help. And since then we've been kind of working at creating other spaces, for instance the fifth schedule and the kind of issues that arise around it and the sixth schedule. They are important in constitutional law, they are important on their own, they are important in environmental law. You can't study the Forest Rights Act unless you know what the fifth schedule is about. So there's a range of ways in which it has to get. So the breaking down of our constitution into those parts that we deal with and the parts that we forget, that maybe we need to, that's the only binary that I accept. I think binaries are dangerous ways of looking at things. So I would really advise against any kind of binary learning or thinking. The second thing is really very different from the morning, in the sense it's not about the clinical, because in clinical I understand that Ved was perfectly right. We don't know who we are dealing with, but we think we're taking solutions to them. It takes years to realize that actually maybe we didn't know, and then find out what is wrong, and then figure out what we need to do there. So there's one whole set of issues in that. But there is something else that I find is actually dying, which is the dealing with ideas. And we don't seem to do it at all, especially when we do, like in Madras Law College, we did statutory method. So you study the statute and then that's it, you know your law. Or you do case law method. And it's within this little universe that gets created and we don't know how to get out of it. And the Bar Council having said that large parts of jurisprudence can just be left out and it's an optional subject, I think that's very, very detrimental to the law learning and law teaching. I can't think of anything worse that could have happened. Because we know the way, we know what what law is. We know that statute law is something that is made by Parliament, and we know the process, we know the politics, what we know, we know. And judge-made law, at this point in our history, I won't say another word about it. So we can't make this a universal. It's not just knowledge, it's also about learning how to think. If I look at what's been happening in the courts over the past 20-25 years, the one distinct thing that I can see has happened is there's been no development of law. There have been cases, there are various kinds of things happening. But the idea that we know where we are headed and why we are headed there, and that we need to develop the law in that direction, that simply doesn't exist. So we've all become reactive, pragmatic, and when I say we all, I mean like lawyers, people who are writing about what the courts are doing. All of us have become just immediate and reactive and at best pragmatic. So this, it's been bothering some of us that we are not dealing with ideas. So this is just to introduce what we did in an experiment recently. But before I go to that, 3 years ago at Nirma, in fact, I heard Professor Ajappa for the first time teaching teachers how to teach jurisprudence. And honestly, I had never heard anything like it before, because that level of clarity and that level of respect for another person's thought, I hadn't seen before. So I think one exercise that we may want to undertake is when we see teachers of this time, we lose them and then we lose what they have with them. So with all the technology that's available now, I really think it's important not, to preserve what they have to offer, because it's an incredible thing that they offer, and it's very dangerous to lose it. Working with Professor Ajappa, I also realized that many of them, he said it wasn't just him, others to make notes in certain kinds of ways, which themselves are processes of learning. So, how do you distill the ideas that come from a theorist? What is the kind of reading that you do? How do you represent it? If you just have to represent it in one sheet of paper, how do you do it? They have all of this. So one thing that we may need to do is to start creating archives, because there are history archives, there are political science archives. There's really very little in law. So if we could, even in the places where each of us is, if we could start with creating these archives of their written work, over a period of time we know which of that has value, and if some of it doesn't matter. We can always decide what to do with it then. That experiment with Professor Ajappa is what, and because of the last year in NLS, really bright kids, before you say it, they've understood it, but there was only one contract I was trying to get in with them, which was to say, I'm going to, if you give me, we're discussing quota. Say, if you give me one position on quota, 1 hour, you'll pass. But if you give me 2, you'll do really well. Because there are many points of view. If you give me 3, you'll be like super bright. Now work at it. Don't give me an argument every time. Think. And I found that the brightest of them had difficulty in doing that. All of us, see I'm hurrying through because it's really not fair to take too much time, but this thing of having prejudices, which all of us do, having opinions, which many of us do, but learning what public reasoning is, which is what we need to do to make law a learned profession, that we don't seem to be able to do. So sometimes on poverty cases in the court, I find lawyers are standing up there and arguing, saying, don't do this to the court. The court that's no argument at all. And that's because we haven't learned how else to think that we can represent this. And we'll never develop the law like this. So the idea was to try and find a way by which we can work at producing something beyond prejudice and opinion. While we have prejudice and opinion, all of us will have it. None of us is going to deny it of ourselves, but how do you move beyond that? How do you deal with this idea of ideas? And it was just an experiment. Maya was there, Nitish ditched us, and a few others was there the last time. We just had it in 3 sessions. We had people come in. We just had 5 ideas, and just plucked the ideas out of our heads, because it didn't matter what the idea was. It was about how you deal with the idea. So we had something like purity and pollution, good law, bad law, extraordinary laws and state of exception, citizenship, and silence. And God, like you were saying, not just Gagan isn't here, but there was only one lawyer among the seniors who spoke. There are 2 political scientists, one was a philosopher, and one was Bezawada Wilson, who I can't find a description for him. So he's not a social entrepreneur. Please, it's not fair. So yeah, we'll discuss that. So anyway, and then we had 4 youngsters who also spoke with them to tell us what the status is of these ideas. How do we think about these ideas now? And then just got 5 people, sent these people away and had 5 people sit there and discuss among themselves, have a conversation, not make a presentation, not be discussants, but just learn to think beyond what we think we know about the idea. And we learned how difficult it is to do that, but how exciting it is. And then in the afternoon we had non-hierarchical jurisprudential learning of jurisprudence, or theory. This was just an experiment, but what it did tell me is that academic spaces, I think the biggest problem you guys have is your trimester business. I think it's going to kill everything. You can make any attempt you want, your trimester will kill everything. So if you don't change that, we can talk till the cows come home. I don't think it's going to make any difference. You've got really bright kids with you. You know, when I did law, those of us who couldn't get anywhere went to law. Now you have people making this as a choice and they are coming to you. And you're not able to capitalize on that. You're just destroying their minds with this kind of whatever it is that you do. But if they have some time to stay with what they are reading, stay with what they are doing, just let it sink in a bit. You have time with them for them to be able to develop them, not just as points that they have to mark everywhere, but as, you know, as thoughts and ideas and notions that they can develop. Then two things are likely to happen. One, we'll have better development of the law, including in the courtroom. And the second thing is we'll stop having reactive literature. And we'll have something that will help us take us away from where we are. Right now, somebody says something, we react to it. And somebody who doesn't know anything is very often saying the things that they are saying, and we are only spending our lifetimes reacting to it. So there's just one other thing maybe I should say, that Ved was head of the Delhi Judicial Academy for a while. And I found that from the time, you know, when you started with giving them all that initiation into various kinds of ways of thinking, the first time I went to Delhi Judicial Academy and spoke on poverty, there were 80 people there and almost everyone said, ma'am, but what do we have to do with it? We are all, you know, lower judiciary and we have nothing to do with the constitution. And then it was like an effort to tell them why it was, you know, why the constitution was relevant for them and why they needed to know it. But the last 2 years when I've gone, it's completely changed. Something, you know, so it does make a difference if we keep working at something. Where now they set out, they say this is what we want to discuss because, for instance, postbeggarly has now become I'm super happy that at least in 2 jurisdictions, even if it's by the same judge, that law has been struck down. But the thing is that they were setting out these questions saying, but this law is unconstitutional, how do we deal with this? They were asking, when it comes to DNA and, you know, abstracting DNA from people, I don't know if you know, in Bombay they had this briefly where they were saying that beggars who are carrying children, when beggars who are carrying children in their arms, they would be tested to see if they were actually related by blood or not, because otherwise they're only being used for begging. And when it is the poor, it's all right for any kind of experiment to be done on them. There is absolutely no, there's nothing, there are no walls at all. So these then will start, you know, they started questioning it in the Judicial Academy. So it does make a difference to give that kind of effort and the training and push beyond case law and statute law. And again, my last word is going to be what I said a little, down with trimester system.
Thanks very much, Usha. I now invite Sachin to share his comments with us.
Hi. So first I thought there was no presentations, then I was told there should be a presentation, which I did prepare, and then again there's no presentations. Right, so maybe I'd like to begin with a story, right? Because everyone looks like a little bit of listening fatigue over the day, so maybe I'll just begin with a story. So in 2016, I was living in Washington, D.C. I was working with an organization called Ashoka at that time. And I went to Baltimore, which is pretty close to Washington, D.C. And I was at a college there. And I came next to me at this kind of workshop. There was this young man, he was 19 years old. His name was Rahim. He was a 19-year-old young black man. And he and I we were chatting, right? So after he understood my accent, and I understood his accent, which took a minute. But once we started understanding each other, he was telling me a story. And at some point he said, you know, I'm everything because of my mom, right? And I was like, wow, this is like an Indian man, you know, everything because of his mother. But then he explained to me that when he said that he was everything because of his mother, he was very, like, he was serious about that, because he had been incarcerated in jail for charges of trading in narcotics. And his mother had helped the public prosecutor to get him acquitted of that. And I was like really fascinated. I asked him, what do you mean by your mother helped you do that? And then he told me about this program called Participatory Defense, where families of incarcerated, and by the way, I don't know if you know, but the US has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. I didn't know that. And the rate of incarceration in terms of minorities is just, I mean, it's quite shocking, right? And he told me about this program called Participatory Defense, where the families of young men of color who were incarcerated were being trained to act together as a community and support the public prosecutor in getting that accused acquitted. And there was a lot underneath that, because you had to empower these young mothers mostly. They had to work together and research and get letters from the churches that said, this is a good boy, he didn't, when you're sentencing, please recognize that, when you're considering, please recognize. They had to convince the public prosecutors to hear these, to work with these mothers, because public prosecutors like, who the hell are you? And then finally I got to meet the person who created this program. He was not a lawyer. His name was Raj Jaidev. And Raj Jaidev, he's an American of Indian origin. He explained to me, he said, it was very simple. When I saw this problem, I realized that there's nothing I can do with the courts. There's nothing I can do to, on a point of law. I can harness the emotional energy of these mothers who want to get their children out, who are often falsely accused, and not just the energy to get their own children out, to get the kids of other mothers out. So now, participatory defense, whenever a chapter is set up in a city, so it's not, even if your own child is acquitted, you work till the last child is acquitted. So, why am I sharing this story? I'm sharing this story because I was fascinated with the mind of Raj Jaidev. His mind was not a typical mind. He thought, here's a problem. Who's most affected? How do I bring them all together? Oh, I need to make them believe first they can do this. Okay. I need to then bring them all together and show them their collective power. Okay. I need to convince the public prosecutors to work with these families. Okay. I mean, then he thinks to himself, and by the way, I want to tell you the size of Participatory Defense, the organization, 12 people. They work in 36 cities. So to the point of how do you scale, he figured it would not be scaling the organization, like building a big organization. I would have to be establishing chapters of these young mothers all across the country. So he went to the most incarcerated cities, Ferguson and others, where huge issues were happening, and he built these chapters there. But he said there's nothing more powerful than the energy of a family member who says, get my child out. So I tell this story because I think that there is a huge opportunity where it comes to legal education. An opportunity to upgrade legal education. We often talk rather casually about educating social engineers, but we don't teach them engineering skills. That is the central hypothesis. How can you expect someone to be a social engineer without engineering? And I don't mean engineering as in, not engineering, but engineering, how to create things, how to create systems, see connections, bring them together. So as someone who's never taught formally, even though I spent many years, my first organization was Law School Tutorials, which is the largest test prep company in the law space. So I spent a lot of time teaching people. I never taught law formally. I had this experience of 10 years seeing social entrepreneurs work, and it made me think a ton about law and legal education that I had received and where that needed to go. So I would just want to share some thoughts with you based on those experiences. Maybe Push can. So essentially, my hypothesis, and this I'm not saying this is a perfect hypothesis, was that present-day legal education equips lawyers to work the system. Right? What does that mean? It means you understand its origins, you understand how it functions, you speak its language, you navigate it for self and others, and you propagate it. Now I know that this will probably upset legal educators, because that may not be your intention, but that's really what it's feeding into, unfortunately. If you just move on. So it creates this highly ritualized system of colors, behavior, language. The central actors of the system are always lawyers and judges, when the central actors of any system are its users. Constantly lawyers, judges, and to some extent teachers and academics, right? But not Ram Singh from Dilbag trying to figure out how to get justice. Our future legal education has to equip lawyers to improve existing systems and create new ones. It can't abandon what it was doing, but it has to add these other capabilities. What this means is to understand these systems, not one system, but systems deeply, to know the users of those systems, to identify points of leverage to change these systems, to conceive of new systems for users, to propagate these better systems, and to constantly evolve their own role within new systems. And each of these, one can spend a lifetime like going into each of these things, but I just want to touch on them and maybe color in some of those points. So some of the skills that I think need to become a part, if we really want to create social engineers, are systems thinking. First, being able to recognize what is a system. A system is not one thing. A cross-section of something with certain roles and demand and supply can be a system. What is a system? Which system is a certain person a part of? What are the forces in that system? Design thinking. How do you look at a problem originally and see it for really what it is? And how do you bring the best people together to be able to solve that problem? Maybe law is the tool to solve it, but the methodology might be from outside the conventional system of education. Empathy. Empathy is not sympathy, empathy is not pity, empathy is deep understanding. And what is empathy? And how do we practice it on a daily basis and in our design of things? Problem solving. I think what Usha was saying as well, genuine problem solving, right? Like going back and seeing what is this thing and not getting into argument state, like I can prove this and I can show that, but really like what is it? Like push it, what is it? And finally collaboration. And I'm not ruling out, of course, the classic skills, critical thinking, strategic writing, oral communication, task management, but I'm just sort of emphasizing these new things that also need to be brought into the playbook of what legal education should be. And the thing is, these are skills that are learned only in practice. You cannot learn systems conceptually. You have to see systems in force, see them act. You can't learn empathy by imagining something. You have to be there. So these are skills that are learned only in practice. This is what it looks like. Not that earlier highly ritualized framework of speaking the language, making the argument, communicating. This is what problem solving with groups, solving issues, empathizing looks like and feels like. You can go on. Yeah, out there in the field, talking to people, it has a totally different complexion to it. So, and there's a dear friend of mine, David Namias. He's a lawyer in the US, and he wrote this article, which I would really encourage everyone to read, called The Change-Making Lawyer. It's in the California Law Review. It came last year. And he articulated these 3 goals for change-maker lawyers. He said, they seek to overcome long-standing norms in the legal profession. They design novel organization structures that reflect their values. They don't bother, it doesn't look like a law firm, doesn't look like a department, doesn't look like an NGO. And this is why I'm always amused when people say my goal is to set up an NGO. I don't quite understand what that means. Your goal should be solve the problem. It doesn't matter whether it's an NGO or not. Create transdisciplinary practices that bridge legal fields and other sectors. Maybe for some problem to be solved, you have to be a law, technology, media company. For another problem to be solved, you have to be a behavioral sciences, law, something. Are we comfortable imagining those scenarios and building the right organizations for that? So it's an article which I really strongly recommend pushing. And that's the kind of mind that would create things like, on the left side, participatory defense. That's Rahim at the back, the person wearing a short t-shirt. Youth courts, young people in New York judging other young people who are accused of committing crimes. Why? Because young people best understand. Why did this other young person do this? And they can decide, hey, you know what, Mike, I know you're saying that, your mother is an alcoholic and this is what happened, but I get it, but you still you did something wrong, you're going to have to do community service. I get it. Thanks, Paula. I get it. Respect. You can figure this out. You can trust young people to solve issues because they maybe best understand what they've gone through. And ideas like IDI, right? It's not coming from typical, just what law school gave you. It's coming from this multidisciplinary mind that has touched and felt different aspects of life, right? So, strongly believe the best way to predict the future is to create it. Are we going to get to the next phase of legal education by iterating on what we've taught law students before, or are we going to get there by radically upgrading how we are bringing up social engineers, the mission of the law school? I think that this room needs to fill up with a lot of people from outside the academic circles in order to really overhaul what it means to educate lawyers for the future.
Thanks very much, Sachin. Right on 12 minutes there, and I hope we get to apply some of those skills to a couple of interactive sessions we have on this program as well, with regard to going forward with the plan for a new approach to justice education in South Asia. I would now like to invite Professor Parameshwaran to share his comments with us. So you get the award for the most curiosity-piquing title on the program, I think.
Thanks a lot. I'm very happy that I could present these ideas here. I thank Dr. Purvi, Bai, Sarsu, and Asha for informing about this. And yes, so taking things from what the two speakers had said, I just need to tell only one small point. Since my childhood, I was always affected by injustice. If somebody beats somebody, I feel like crying and I almost cry. So I used to fight with them and say that don't beat that boy. But then I used to wonder that it still happens. If not this boy, somebody else will be beating somebody else. So I was very upset with this. So I come from a family of lawyers. I belong to 5th generation lawyer. So my father groomed me that you are going to inherit the entire legal practice. My father and grandfather and great-grandfather, they practiced in English courts and so on. So there was so much expected out of me, and it put a lot of pressure on me. But then I felt that I like law not because that justice is important, but I like law because injustice should not have taken place first. That was my core belief. But I was dissatisfied. I studied law, I studied masters, I did my doctorate. I worked in prestigious university for 5 years. I worked in law school, I worked in NLE Jodhpur, I worked in every top law schools I could work. I was so dissatisfied with this idea of legal education. And then what happened to me was, at one point of time I left everything, I joined a spiritual organization saying that let me be peaceful myself. So I became a monk for 3 years. I served the society, whatever they told, whatever they asked me, I did everything. But even then I was not satisfied because I felt that I am going away from the problem, not solving it. Going away from the problem is not solving the problem. Maybe I am not seeing the problem before me, but I need to solve it. That's where I came out of the ashram again, much to criticism against everybody, saying that you have done this, you have done sin, you have done that. But I said it's absolutely fine. It is between me and God. If He exists in front of me, I am talking. You don't need to bargain for me. I came out, and then that's exactly where I realized that the topics that I am teaching is only what Madam Usha said, that statutory based law. We teach that. So I got very upset, and it has been going on in my mind and heart that legal education ought to be different. Why? There are various reasons which we all know that the current legal education is very inadequate, so much of injustice everywhere. But then we need to promote something alternative. But alternative should be such that it should collaborate with the existing. We cannot just cut and then move to the next. So I realized that the legal education, which is very inadequate now, is precisely because of one core reason. There are multiple instances, but one core reason is that, as Madam has pointed out, the statutory interpretation and the statutory insistence is precisely because of an analytic tradition which believes only in logic and reasoning. As a result of which the entire justice system is only social and economic, they don't care about psychological and greater well-being. So human rights has become justice seeking in the name of revenge. A man has been robbed of something, or a woman has been slapped, she goes to the court. What happens to her? She is interested in putting that person in jail. Or she is interested in doing something with that offender. What happens to that offender? We are not bothered about. She suffers a lot. He suffers a lot, whomsoever is the victim. So I realized that how do we address this question? So this analytic tradition, which is very good, legal reasoning and logic, which is very good, but it deals only with the human externals, the social externals. It doesn't deal with the higher well-being. So I realized that human rights must move towards from rights paradigm to flourishing paradigm, the well-being paradigm. the well-being paradigm it needs to go. So legal education, I thought if it has to come, we say that it must be diverse, it must be inclusive, it must be sustainable, it must be positive, it must be pluralist, all those things are, but how? That's exactly, I got into a small group, having studied 9 religions as a practice, doing the meditation of most of the religious exercises and so on. I realized that each and every religion has a spiritual tradition. I'm only using the word spirituality, religion, because of a nomenclature. We all believe in the nomenclature of values. We don't have any doubts on that. So we will use that, but for the time being, I have to use this to navigate, to go into that. So I realized that each and every religion has a value system, which is there locked in a tradition. Over a period of time, it got incrusted in the social culture, and that started being misinterpreted, warped interpretation, where all power structures play and then hegemony and all those things come into picture. So I realized that I have to touch into the legal education or bring into each and every subject of the legal education certain core value, and that core value must be a universal core value, not a core value according to one culture times specific context. Again, the problem will come if we go according to that. So there has to be a universal broad spectrum value. How do we go about that? So I took 2 subjects, which is religion and spirituality, and I introduced it in the legal education itself, which I am currently teaching in university as an elective paper. So what are the advantages of teaching this? Before I get into that, I will give you 2-3 examples of how religion and spirituality, if we have, it will solve most of the problems which we have, and that too at a preventive level. I fully agree, the religion and spirituality in which there are a lot of poisonous weeds which are there already. So studying religion and spirituality with a new inquiry will help us to even remove the old weeds, bad weeds, and then put the new weeds, or if there are any good plants which are there, that also can be taken up. So I have 2 objectives, 2 approaches in mind to study law, religion, spirituality, and this religion and spirituality across all religions, to find out the wrong ones which is not suiting to our current requirement, and to find out the good ones so that we can actually incorporate. So how do we do that? How is it done? For example, when 377 was to be decriminalized, I was a foremost champion to say that 377 should be decriminalized. Very simple reason. People said that you are coming from ashram, you are a spiritual person, how can you say this? I said in spirituality there is no gender. Vikriti evam prakriti. Even the abnormal is normal. Then second, I gave some 20 examples like this. Sustainable development is the best principle which goes from time to timeless. When I'm basically a teacher of public international law and private international law. Here's Lauter Pash, one of the renowned jurists of International Law Commission. Every international commission, those days he used to start with a quotation from the Bible. He says that refugee convention comes from Jesus, the sense of protection for those who fear persecution, who run away. So everyone had this idea of a core value. Only thing, it got stuck in a nomenclature, or it got warped because of social perversion or power control. These are the only things which we can easily handle. So 377 I could easily do. So when 377 happened, actually, I gave a faculty seminar which came out in newspaper also, to the extent that here is one person who is saying it is actually correct according to scripture. I felt very happy, but it took me several years. Sustainable development. So what I did when I created a course outline on law, religion, spirituality, justice, I sent my course outline to all the law professors of justice across various law schools, especially US and UK, which I concentrated. And equally I sent all the religious leaders, including Dalai Lama, Pope, Vatican, Sufi interfaith leaders, and the United Nations interfaith groups. Everyone told their accusation, saying that this needs to be taken, precisely because this religion and spirituality, which deals with the core consciousness of the human thinking, is by nature interdisciplinary, is by nature multidisciplinary, is by nature heterogeneous, is by nature sustainable. So I showed 20 illustrations to do this and 45 instances across the world in which people are doing it in the legal tradition but without knowing what they are doing it. For example, Ecuador in Constitution, they have considered mountain as a special right. New Zealand Mongshu River, recently it happened, it is a person. I immediately wrote to the law minister of New Zealand saying that what was your argument before the parliament, can you give me? After much hesitation, he gave me some 140 pages of the argument which he placed before the parliament, we consider river as a person, and there are two orders who are protecting it. My God, if anybody reads it without reading the front part and the last part, it looks like as if some spiritual document somebody is giving some sermons. But since it happened in the parliament, since it happened in the legal structure, I found it is very useful. So religion, spirituality, justice, law, justice, these are very highly interlinked and it's highly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. And most important, it brings the continuity of the past, present and the future, which we are missing now. Because if you miss any of the past groups or any of the groups which are locked in the past traditions, that is also a kind of injustice after a point of time, because they should also have access to justice. No matter we characterize them good or bad. We cannot avoid them. So it brings continuity, it brings inclusiveness, and it gives interfaith angle. So what I did was to move people from a pejorative, warped idea of communal understanding to religion and spirituality to a compassionate and empathetic understanding by finding the right sources, right spirit across all religions. So we took 20 instances in our university. Take the case of abortion. Which religion says yes or no, pro-choice or pro-life? You could easily identify why he is saying like this. No, this guru is saying like this, but it was not said in the Bible. It was not said in the Bible. So people could very easily connect with, wow, this is how my tradition is, this is how my religion is. But then slowly we got into it. When we got into the core of it, we actually got into the core values of things in which people forgot the religion, people forgot the law, systems and everything. People felt very happy and we all are feeling just. We all are feeling equal. That experience happened among 25 to 30 students, which I experienced for 3 years. So, to put it in a very simple way, if you ask, there are people who ask, what do you mean by the term spirituality and all? I used to give this simple explanation: oneness, unity, compassion, empathy, mutual respect, shared values, and so on. It goes on and on. And there is a very good recognition for this course also. Next year I am taking this course to USA. 3 Ivy League universities are wanting me to teach this and research there. So I feel that the legal education to become justice education, we need to identify the core universal value in each and every subject the way one wants. And if you can pitch it across all divisiveness and all discordant modes, it is not that difficult. So at the same time, we can also bring in this topic the most important the conflict that all pedagogists undergo is whether doctrinal or empirical, but this suits both. Because value can never be only a doctrinal value. Value has to be a practical value also. So this is where I found that those who see, they used to ask me, so you are teaching doctrinal method or empirical method? For me, there is no difference. If you are teaching a value, it has to have a utility. Otherwise, it may not. So these are my thoughts, and I would like to share my article which I wrote on this later. And I thank everyone for this wonderful patient hearing. Sorry, I had to rush through fast because I got a chance to speak, which is a very difficult topic to cover. Thank you.
Thank you.